Friends, today our story begins at once, with a very tense situation in which flames are blazing all over the area, and fire splinters are flying. At this point, there is a very intense battle to the death between two huge monsters. Suddenly, all of a sudden, a very strong flame appears, which begins to dazzle everything and everyone around it, as well as scattering more shards and flames around the rock. At this point, someone was holding a gun that was on fire. It turns out that there was only the last man left. Suddenly, all of a sudden, a man-like monster began to reach forward with his fiery hand, declaring that it would be his victory. At that moment, the dragon flew very high into the sky, but he was also watched by the young boy, who was waiting for the right moment to deliver his final blow, because their duel was also not for life, but for death. Suddenly, he felt uncomfortable as his body took a tangible hit, which even made him vomit blood for the first time. From this, the guy immediately sat down on his knee to at least catch his breath before continuing, and sticking his sword in the ground. He stopped and looked at the situation at hand. After that, the thought immediately crossed his mind that this world had come to an end. Everything around them continued to blaze, and the people had been defeated for a year now, in a war with the evil demons that had overrun them. Moreover, most people were simply brutally murdered and cities destroyed, and the survivors had been captured, destroying their mental capacity and using them as hosts to give birth to new monsters. In addition to the burning cities, the dungeon contained a huge number of different spiders and insects, which had a terrifying appearance and inspired fear. And as the last survivor of the resistance, the warrior continued to fight, waving his sword heroically. But it didn't last long, and literally until now. As suddenly, lower than in the dungeon, most likely already even in hell, a demon appeared in front of the warrior, who looked at him with a serious and unwavering gaze, showing confidence in himself and his powers. It was the demon Lord Tartarus, who was the monarch of demons and inspired real fear in his opponents. At this point, he noticed that the guy looked really pained, and he wanted to really help him with it. Then, he flexed his fingers, and out of them formed a very bright flash and hologram that dazzled everyone around him. 15 seconds later, it had already completely engulfed the warrior, who was really very exhausted. He stopped time for him, so that they could at least talk a little among themselves, and he continued, addressing our warrior with the word man, then immediately corrected himself, for he remembered that his name seemed to be Zephyr. He praised him and scolded him at the same time, saying that the warrior was the first one to bother him so persistently. He was delighted, for he was surprised at such astonishing persistence, for which he praised the lad so much. At that moment, behind him there was a faint silhouette of a guy kneeling in front of him, listening to his story. It was obvious that he was several times smaller than he was. But also the Demon King remembered the saying, because it is not for nothing they say that he who fights with no chance of victory is really stupid, and those who surrendered, afraid of the strength of the enemy, are not wise at all. He waved his arms beside the exhausted warrior, and went on to say that they were just fools. After that, his body and eyes were filled with anger, and everything around him went up in flames. He said he gets even angrier when he gets the weak and impatient ones, who can be safely called trash. Then he smiled and looked in the warrior's direction, saying that he would surely understand him, for he, too, was the strongest of men. That's why it didn't end there, and the demon looked at him again, then said that he had a good offer for him. Thus he summoned Zephyr to come completely to his side. He told him it was time to leave this filthy earth and start conquering others, including the abode of the gods. And all this realization he calmly plans thanks to their combined efforts. After he finished his sentence, he immediately reached out his hand to the warrior, who was still kneeling, leaning on his sword. At this point, Zephyr looked at him suspiciously and said absolutely nothing at first. Then he exhaled sharply and asked if Tartarus would really accept him on his team. He was very glad of this answer and said that of course he would accept it, without any hesitation. The warrior looked at him once more with a kind and faithful look, and then said something about how that really sounded good, even though deep down he fully understood that it was absolutely bullshit. All he could think about was that battle, because he knew he was mortally wounded, and there was absolutely no way for Tartarus to know that there was nothing more he could do. At this point, he took another look at his back, which was like a jigsaw puzzle that could safely be put together in pieces. But he had absolutely no idea that the Demon King was offering him something to conquer together, and was also telling the guy that he would give him a chance. He immediately came to his senses and realized that it didn't look like a suggestion. Looks like Tartarus just wants to see the guy plead his case like some kind of coward. He immediately imagined the demon laughing at him and his life, and realizing that he was begging the enemy who had taken everything he held dear from him, friends and loved ones. At this point, he extended his hand to the demon in response to his offers, and then a bit of a bond began to form between them, though the demon and the guy hadn't even had time to shake hands yet. This deal made Tartarus insanely happy, as he got another super strong warrior for his team. True, his character does make you wish for more. At that moment, he was approached by a girl who looked like an angel, who radiated only kindness and positivity, who made remarks to him not to swear. At this point, he also noticed that he never listens to anyone, so instead of all that, he decides to just do a fun spell. It seems like he really went back to the future for a second, and remembered the interesting moments he had had. At this point, the warrior and demon were finally able to shake hands with each other fully, tacitly confirming their cooperation. At that moment, the guy was really tense. You could see how he was becoming absolutely uncomfortable. His body was covered in cold sweat. He was obviously worried about something. At this point, he continued to kneel and squeeze his new partner's hand. But he also noticed that if he did all this with his hand, the power that was beyond him would just tear his body apart. At that moment, his eyes changed dramatically. You could see that he was much braver than he had been a few minutes earlier. He squeezed his eyes shut and said that he was ready to give his final answer to the devil Tartarus. Then he just gave him the middle finger and told him to go away. He was very aggressive indeed, for he was speaking in this way toward the devil himself. But he didn't seem to care about it at all. At that moment, something absolutely unexpected appeared, after which the flash was so bright that it blinded absolutely everything around it. It seemed to be a crow carrying some kind of message or biting the warrior's sword. At that moment, Zephyr was focused as much as possible and controlled the huge flare that formed after the collision, and all because he wanted to prove first of all to himself that he could resist even Tartarus. Immediately after a few seconds, there was a huge explosion, which was the result of such a strong confrontation. Absolutely everything around was blown apart and on fire. It would have been impossible for a mere human to survive. At that moment, everything continued to blaze, and there was absolutely nothing to be seen among the walls of smoke that were formed by the flames. There was only a single silhouette of the demon Lord Tartarus, who seemed to be still trying to repel the attack by meditation, and then planned to fly into the sky. At that moment, he opened his eyes like a predator, which made even me really uncomfortable, not to mention the emotions Zephyr might have felt when he saw it. At this point, he was very shocked and surprised, as it seems that because of such a strong attack and striking power, his whole arm fell off, which he could not have expected. He looked at it again and didn't understand what was going on, what was wrong with his hand. There was complete bewilderment in his eyes. He could not even imagine that such a thing could happen to him, much less at the hands of an ordinary man. Suddenly, he fell suddenly into a stupor and didn't know what to do. Then his anger gradually began to overtake him, and he was ready to take revenge and destroy absolutely everyone and everything. He screamed with anger and pain at the same time. All this could be heard for hundreds of miles. He was very aggressive, clenched his teeth, straining absolutely every muscle in his body. It looked like his main goal right now was to get revenge. At that moment, the warrior simply fell to his knees. He was without strength. He was simply destroyed by the flames and the battle he was engaged in. Unfortunately, it did absolutely nothing and he was petrified, turning into a small statue. And then, 10 seconds later, he started screaming like a demon, which was no surprise. As much as he could, he insulted him and told him he was the meanest person he had ever met. It was just inconceivable to him how he dared to do that to him. At that moment, the demon struck the warrior with all its might, filling him with anger and hatred, causing the guy's body to just shatter all over the place. That's exactly how his battle ended. A battle in which he failed to avenge those he held dear, and also failed to protect everyone as he had promised. After looking at his petrified hand once more, he went on to say that it ended in a truly shameful defeat. He then went on to say that this was how it was supposed to be, as suddenly his hand appeared, which had not been turned to ashes, and was functioning normally. Zephyr just kept lying on the ground while conscious, but the funny thing was, he really had trouble moving. He didn't know what was going on. It felt like he was in some kind of vacuum. It's kind of like he just died, isn't it? But this is very strange, since all of his wounds had miraculously healed, and all of his armor was just as intact. He just kept sitting there in incomprehension. Had he really dreamt it all? At that moment, a blue arch appeared in front of him, with a light glow at the end, and very old sculptures on the sides. He could not tell where he was, but it seemed to be a gateway to the eternal world. After which he even sat down, as he could not calmly look at it all. At this point, he finally turned his attention to the statues of the gods that were on the sides. Was there really such a temple somewhere? He still couldn't remember, and kept looking around the room. He was dressed very nicely, like a real warrior, but something was bothering him. He wasn't particularly worried, though, as it was clear to him that he was now facing the entrance to the afterlife, which he wasn't even surprised about. Suddenly he stopped and realized that this was not the afterlife at all, as it seemed at first glance, which made him wary. It turned out that they were now on the lower level of the pantheon, the abode of the gods. It was just a beautiful sight, as something magical and holy began to bud right in front of his eyes. At that moment, an angel girl appeared, just like the one he had seen when he was in hell and fighting Tartarus. She was very beautiful and calm, with a lot of kindness and positive energy. At that moment, Zephyr tried to cover his eyes with his hand at least a little, so as not to see such a beautiful and bright flash, and at the same time to call on his sword. It was noticeable that he was not used to seeing anything like this in his life. But what was very surprising to him was that he had no way to summon the sword. Immediately, the angel interrupted him and said that there was absolutely nothing to be surprised about. After all, she is only here to give him the will of the gods. And her name is Mercedes, and she is the highest level of all the angels. She was very pretty, but informed the guy that he was already dead and following the procedure. She should have sent the guy straight to the underworld, but because of the insistence of several gods for him, then she will not do so, since the 3 supreme gods have decided to send him back in time. The Zephyr was as shocked as possible from this, and stood motionless. He stopped once more and tried to figure out what it all meant. It turns out that he has to go back in time one more time, but with exactly the same memories he has now. And that means only that now he will have a chance to change the course of the fight and turn things in his favor. The only thing that will be different is that he will remain without all the acquired skills, namely magic and endurance. At this point, Zephyr stood and just listened to what he was being told, after which the angel went on to say that he had once already been the one who climbed to the top of the human pyramid. That's why she thinks he will have absolutely no trouble recovering. He was just shocked and kept listening to what he was told. And yet he stood there and couldn't believe it was real, wondering if he was dreaming, as a demon doesn't seem to have mastered the art of illusion. He also kept thinking maybe this was his dying euphoria. as he suddenly just stood up and exhaled sharply in relief. After that, he went up to the angel and asked why he hadn't decided to give him that chance. The girl responded by telling him that it was really hard to believe, and she could really give him proof that it was real, which would help him to be sure. But he dismissed that, assuming he believed it, and he just wanted to ask them, what did he have to do after all? His gaze was simply shocked. It was the first time he had been in such a state. After all, he was used to the fact that in the world you always have to pay for everything, no? That's why his thoughts were focused on the fact that the gods needed something from him. That's why they were giving him a chance. It turns out when demons were killing people by the thousands, when people prayed with all their hearts, the gods simply cut off communication with our world. They absolutely did not answer prayers and did not accept offerings. Moreover, they also took away the powers of the priests, who could fight by borrowing the power of the gods. This is how the human army, which had lost its defensive and healing skills, was defeated in the blink of an eye. Our warrior added, saying that they simply gave up on us once they realized they wouldn't get anything else here. At this point, his gaze became quite stern. It seemed to really hurt him. At this point, he became very angry at them, saying that such freaks couldn't give him a chance for nothing. That's why the angel heard him, lowered her eyes, and said she would give him the will of the gods. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him very intently, as if she were in a completely different world. It was at this point that she said they demand more bread and circuses. At this point, the warrior's face just twisted. He absolutely could not understand how this could be from the gods, as it meant that they wanted to see even more of the despair and hopelessness people were experiencing. Even though he was in the temple, he got angry and shouted, once again questioning what they really meant. It became known to the gods, who took notice of him, that the warrior was dead. And indeed, it is rare to meet a man who will walk so steadfastly to the end, even when only death awaits him ahead. The angel then looked at him and went on to say that the battle with the many monsters that he had fought for 5 years was, as previously stated, very interesting. At that moment, he was just shocked. He was immediately struck with panic and aggression, because he didn't expect it. Well, Angel at this point went on to say that many gods would be upset if it ended very quickly, so they watched him. Didn't he remember that and didn't notice it? As nearer and nearer the end, his luck was smiling more and more. Angel continued to speak, saying that the tanks were helping him until he paid up. But at that moment, before he had finished listening, a blow began to fly sharply in her direction. It looked like he just wanted to destroy her for it. It was no wonder, for a burst of anger and panic had overtaken him. Though everything near them began to glow with bright blue glare that dazzled absolutely all the space around them. At this point, he continued to insult her. Ask did they really have fun? He then went on to say that they, absolutely everyone fought purely because they wanted to survive. At that moment, he remembered the situation when he was holding his beloved girl as he fought the evil monsters. And immediately he clenched his fist to deliver another blow, for he was really very angry and furious. And can the gods just say that they were having fun and fun? He was just pissed off at us, which you can't even put into words. And do they really think he was fighting just to amuse them? Are they really in a puppet theater? At this point, without waiting for an answer, he just ran off to finish the job. He was just really disgusted that the gods thought of them that way. But the angel didn't seem to care. She just activated her hologram and felt absolutely no emotion at all. Immediately, a second later, there was already a huge chain on the guy's leg that didn't allow him to move much. He was really very small compared to the gods. He tried to at least move, but even that brought him great discomfort. It was obvious that he could not move his leg properly. It was as if it was chained to the ground, and any movement brought him pain and suffering. At that moment, the angel once more waved her hand, closed her eyes, and directed her energy toward the guy, asking him to be at least a little more polite, since the gods are watching him. And now he is already in exactly the same pose he stood in just a short while ago, only talking to the Demon King. Then she went closer to him and said that he probably didn't understand her slightly, which is why she will correct herself, because when the gods say they were interested, they meant only this guy. They have absolutely no interest in people like Russ. At that moment, she took him by the chin and simply lifted his head. Her gaze changed dramatically. She looked like a strange princess who knows absolutely no evil. Then she went on to say that it was simple. If a guy proved that he had value, he could have absolutely everything he wanted. It could be anything, for him personally or for all people. It makes absolutely no difference. After all, as he correctly pointed out earlier, there is always a price to pay, isn't there? That's how the angel interrogated him, after which he just looked at her suspiciously and wasn't so angry anymore. And when he had calmed down enough, the angel stepped back and said that, by the way, there was a god among everyone who persisted in asking to bring Zephyr back for a different reason. This surprised him very much, and he just didn't say anything and continued to listen. And then he was shown a picture of the past, where everything was blown apart, was fire, and just everywhere was fear. At this point, the world of angels was being destroyed by an evil demon who approached the angels and simply terrorized them, asking how much longer he had to wait. He didn't listen to them and hurt them, even though they asked him to calm down, saying that the application he had submitted was still under consideration. Anger swept over him. He really couldn't understand how he, a demon who had gained more than 10 worlds, was able to get knocked out because of some human. He was so angry that he couldn't even express himself properly, just as he couldn't believe the nonsense in question. That's why he screamed and terrorized every angel to make sure that it didn't happen and that it all came back. After that, the demon began to shout that he would pay exactly what it would take, to which the angel and the warrior just kept staring, and Zephyr was just shocked, not understanding what this psycho was doing. The devil Tartaros, god of destruction that has destroyed only 10 worlds, including theirs. His goals are to destroy absolutely all worlds up to this point. He has absolutely never lost, because he was a warrior who had never been wounded. But the boy had managed to ruin his record. He was partly pleased and partly perplexed at the same time. And then the angel asked him if he realized how much his pride had been hurt. At this point, the guy was shocked and couldn't believe it was all just for this reason. He was furious, for this was really some kind of madman. But the angel continued, saying that the demon wanted to fight the guy again and get a clean victory. Then she continued to walk on. That's why she walked even closer to him, looked at him with a smile, and asked what he would say to such a proposal. At this point, the guy sat up for a little while, and suddenly a smile formed on his face, which immediately came to his mind, because it really is such an obvious question. He clenched his hand into a fist and immediately believed in his powers, saying that if he wanted to die one more time, Zephyr would have to do his bidding. At that moment, the angel disappeared somewhere, and it seems to have started teleporting back to the other world. Holograms immediately appeared in front of him, who decided not to waste time and said that the process begins. The point of arrival will be random, but the guy will have enough time to recover his strength. In addition, the gods want to give him a gift. He would be able to check it out as soon as the teleportation to the other world was complete. At this point, he continued to just stand on the holograms and wasn't even surprised at what was happening to him. All the thoughts he had of getting revenge on this demon, and even though these escapes are truly disgusting, Chance has a chance, which is why he uses it to get revenge on his abuser and the gods who abandoned humans. Once the location was chosen, the constellations immediately began to ask for confirmation in order to make a special movement, permission for which was immediately granted. At this point, the angel appeared in front of him once more and said she wished him really good luck and hoped things would be interesting. At that moment, the process of displacement was completely launched, and the angel and the guy completely began to dissolve in the bright glare of the holograms. Suddenly, everything shifted to the real world, and immediately the sky and the clouds near it were visible. And absolutely unexpectedly, some sounds began to appear. Our warrior was already in a stressed and critical state, and his friends were near him, who were trying to wake him up, and began to get very worried about the fact that he was not breathing. They even formed a conflict between them because of this. They just begged him to wake up. After which our warrior, who for some reason began to be called a novice, abruptly woke up and opened his eyes. And to keep him relaxed, a bucket of cold water was immediately poured on him. All this was done to bring him to his senses, after which he immediately felt much better. He was surrounded by very young and strong guys just like him. One of them said that he said he didn't nail it. At this point, one guy kept pouring water on him. But that wasn't the main thing. Our warrior was in a state of shock, as he absolutely could not understand who they were. He looked at the faces of these people, and he really thought he had seen them somewhere. He immediately looked at that tattoo and realized it was a brand. After that, he immediately grabbed his head and remembered, after which he had a sudden fit of laughter. He was really very funny. And a lot of people just didn't understand why this idiot was laughing. But he wondered why he went back exactly 10 years to his 20s. After all, he was the one who went back to a time when he was still serving in the temple as a slave, where everyone mocked him. At that moment, one of them started shouting, asking what was going on, to which the guys immediately said it was nothing special. It turned out to be the boss, who called them to go back to their seats and finish the job. At this point, the guy turned very aggressively to our warrior, saying that if he tried to get involved in the situation one more time, he'd be screwed, he'd be dead. But he was really quite amused by it, so he asked again, what did the idiot say to him? At this point, the guy was very angry and wanted to throw himself at him. But he was stopped, and Zephyr just turned around and walked on, saying that he absolutely did not want to bother with such scum. At that moment, he absolutely unexpectedly saw a girl who was lying on the floor and didn't have much strength. She immediately looked at him and said thank you very much for standing up for her. He wondered what kind of child it was. He concluded that, apparently, because it was 10 years ago, he doesn't remember the details at all. It must take him at least some time to adjust and understand the situation. At this point, he just kept walking on with pickaxe in hand toward the unknown. At that moment, the realization came abruptly to him that there was already a gift for him after all. That's why he took a step and began to think about it. Immediately, an angel appeared before him, informing him that he could use his gift if he said the phrase to use it. He immediately remembered this and decided to see what the gift was. Just when everyone was away and no one was looking at him, he hid behind a rock and said that he needed to open a special advantage, as if reciting his spell. At that moment, he began to glow. Holograms appeared near his body again. Everything was in bright yellow glare. It looked like a transformation was starting to take place. At this point, he was very surprised, telling time to stop a little. He was very surprised and happy at the same time. He could not believe his eyes, because is it really possible? There was a smile and happiness on his face. He was really very, very happy. At this point, his abusers looked at each other and were very surprised, saying that this newcomer was not so simple. Another added that he was an excellent worker, suggesting he was a miner. They watched him work with the pickaxe and noticed how fast he was. Immediately, huge sacks of ore that the miners had added appeared in front of him. His abusers also commented that it would be great if Zephyr worked in their brigade. But because he is trying, and they will also have to start work normally. At that moment, the guy was very surprised, and immediately a smile appeared on his face, because he could not believe until now what was happening. But all of a sudden he clutched his head in pain. It turns out he realized that all the information was in his head in the blink of an eye. His eyes and whole body tensed. He couldn't understand what it was and what was happening to him. It turns out that it was top-class skills and items, as their plaque reported, and which also shone in the background of the hologram. At that moment he became very joyful, for he could not believe that the gods had simply given him all these abilities. One of the masters began shouting sharply at his slave, who was doing absolutely nothing instead of working, and started running in his direction, saying that he had ordered absolutely everyone back to their jobs. He was very angry because he was making a lot less money because of it. So he immediately threatened Zephyr that he would hit him with a whip on his first day of work, and started walking in his direction. Zephyr just looked at him calmly, for he understood that this chief was just coming at him. At that moment, insults flew in his direction, for slaves never understand nicely, and the chief swung his whip to strike. He was very angry and thus wanted to teach the young boy to listen. The whip immediately flew in his direction, but he didn't care. He was cold-blooded and just caught it without a single emotion on his face. At this point, even the boss himself wondered how this guy could catch the whip with his hand. It's unrealistically difficult and painful. But instead of getting back at him, he simply apologized to his boss, saying that right now he would go back to work, from which he just stood there bewildered and didn't even know what to say. At this point, the guy looked at his hand and was very surprised at what had just happened. It turns out that thanks to his past combat experience, he can see every move of his opponents. He was once again surprised and looked at his hand and was a little shocked at what had just happened. Surprisingly, there is not a single scratch on it, and the hand is also completely undamaged. Immediately, not in front of him appeared the system, which reported that activated skill wall of iron, which allows you to increase defense skills and fully absorbs damage below its own level of protection, as well as guarantees high endurance. After that, he immediately continued chiseling away at the stones with a smile on his face, saying that he felt no fatigue at all, so he could even work that way all day. As he continued to break the stones, he noticed that even though his conditions were bad, if he used the skill properly, it would be quite useful, and the gift he was given was quite good. He stopped and began to analyze what was happening, for he had already gained 9 special abilities. But if you also consider all his knowledge of the future, he could quickly regain all his powers. But the first thing he should still do is work. The supervisor in the mine just stopped with a sheet and paper in his hands, and was very shocked, because it was hard even to imagine such a thing. Zephyr simply took the huge bags of ore and sorted them by himself, exceeding the mine's plan by hundreds of %. Without him, they would have worked another 2 months to collect half of what he did in half an hour. At this point, the entire mine immediately went to its well-deserved rest and got a premature end to the day's work. Everyone lined up and waited for the results of the rating, in which the best workers would be announced. First place went to Brigade F, and it turns out that Zephyr and the baby he was protecting are in the same brigade together. Immediately, second place was taken by Team B, from which the offenders who beat Zephyr were shocked, because they did not understand how they were able to take first place so quickly. Then they gave out awards for third and fourth place, which made some people rejoice and some, on the contrary, cry. After all, as the warden pointed out, according to the rules of the mine, all the money and food of the last team is divided between first, second, and third place. At this point, Zephyr and the baby stood together and just watched the situation unfold. Suddenly, the boss shouted out that it was time to pray to the great goddess of light, Arya. Then all the members of the mine raised their hands up and began to ask for her help to save them with her eternal sword and eternal light. It was a very exciting process, but our hero didn't care at all and asked her to save his ass. It turns out that on the continent, among the 3 great deities, the goddess of light Arya is worshipped the most. She is very beautiful and bright, but there is absolutely no way to see her face. In addition, she is also the biggest creditor on the continent. because most of the people here who work in the mine have lost their homes just because of the monsters. Or were just as adventurous as Zephyr, but after the temple saved them from destruction, were enslaved to pay off a huge debt for treatment. At that moment, he looked at his shoulder and realized that as long as it bore the mark of a slave, there was absolutely no way he could move freely. He also understood that if he went outside without permission, his heart would be stopped very quickly. That's why he has to pay back what he owes as soon as possible and regain his freedom. Then you can at least plan something. At this point, he quickly ran, remembering Tartaros, who was no longer getting off that easy this time. He stopped and said he would get back at him, by all means. And suddenly, all of a sudden, a picture appears in front of him, in which a girl is holding the hand of what seems to be some kind of monster. And a second later, he lets her go, and she flies into the abyss, remembering and feeling betrayed. Tears immediately appear on her face, and you can see how upset she is and how she didn't expect to receive this. It was his girlfriend, named Altair. He reached out his hand once more and grabbed his chest, saying that this time he would have his revenge and be able to protect her. Suddenly, he was back in his reality, where a girl was standing, informing him that those who needed to go to the store or to confession could do so right now. Suddenly, all of a sudden, people started ordering beer and potatoes. It turned out that a mug of beer cost as much as 80 silvers. It was very expensive indeed, even for our hero. Perhaps this is because beer was the only joy of the slaves. At this point, the kid Zephyr was sticking up for came up to him and said he would buy him a drink. He was very surprised, asking if he had any money, to which he replied that he had already received his salary, though he would not be able to buy something very expensive. But he could not get past the way he had protected him then in the mine from evil enemies. And also, thanks to him, their brigade was able to take first place. The kid also pointed out that they only had wimps on their team, so it was very difficult for them to win. After all, they were always last and got their money's worth for the first time. At this point, Zephyr looked at the guy and realized why everyone was beating him up. It all became clear, because if at least one miner from the group gets sick or is unable to work, the efficiency of the entire team is greatly reduced. So if you sabotage at least one team in this way, yours will automatically move up. Afterwards, Zephyr thanked the little guy and said that he didn't want to snub the kid and was pretty sure that the guy was doing it to pamper him. So Zephyr asked him to step back and not bother with any nonsense, to which the kid got a little upset, because he absolutely didn't mean it. At this point, Zephyr had already approached the bartender, who was smiling happily, and asked what he had to offer him. He asked if there was some water of recovery. The bartender was very surprised, saying he hadn't seen the guy here before. Was he really new here? If so, did he even have any money? Since the price per glass is 1 gold and 4 golds per bottle. But if the guy isn't howling in pain, he better be patient. To which he kindly threw money on the table, where there was 1.5 gold, and the rest he promised to borrow with a smile on his face. After which he specified that they should have a receipt, so he asked me to get it so he could sign it. At this point, the kid started screaming and grabbing his head, trying to stop the Zephyr. He asked if he was crazy, but at that moment he had already signed the receipt and received his bottle of water. The kid asked if he even knew what would happen if he couldn't pay his obligations. And as it is, out of 2 golds, 1 goes to pay the debt. I'm almost out of money and I don't want to go into debt. To which Zephyr simply looked away, saying how noisy he was. But the little guy cried and just tried to say that the interest on the extra credit was awfully high. But the guy didn't care. He just kept drinking water and said he'd have no problem paying them off too, which made the kid look shocked. Water of recovery is a popular product that replenishes stamina, but if you drink a large amount of it, you can get a hidden effect, an increase in magical energy. But he also noticed that even after drinking 10 bottles, the effectiveness remains low. However, if you have this perk, things really are different and you don't need any elixirs. At this point, he continued to hold his bottle, which he had not yet finished, and everything around him began to glow in blue glare. The system reported that skill vision of Hermes improves the effectiveness of absolutely any potion. In this case, the efficiency increased by 500%. In any case, our hero understands that he can't make much money in the mine, no matter how hard he works. But even if he works as hard as he can, there are absolutely no good rewards. At this point, he pulls out another bottle, and he realizes that he needs to get in shape, after which he immediately starts doing more push-ups, and he wonders what he should do then. At this point, the warden, smoking his cigarette, was a little surprised to ask Zephyr again. Did he really hear howling in the mine? He answered in the affirmative, saying that he wanted him to inform the hunters, and he would lead them to the place where he heard the monsters. There was a very suspicious emotion on his face. He seemed to have really found the answer where to make money, which is why he went to the dungeon. Monsters are creatures that are spawned by a magical flow. At this point, many of them are aggressive and pose a great threat to humans. And although over the years of war, these creatures have caused great damage, their appearance has been a very good help to mankind. Magical crystals and stones around and inside the monsters' bodies, as well as skin and bones, served as an excellent material for creating weapons and armor. As we see, shield and weapons and shoes are of very good quality indeed, so monsters quickly came to be regarded by humans as a valuable resource. Otherwise, it is said that every cave, my gods, conceals a great danger as well as a very good profit. Perhaps behind these doors is something hidden and interesting. At that moment, several people began pacing directly in an incomprehensible direction. They were all armed. They had both hammers and swords and knives, all wearing armor with a silhouette that signified they belonged to the slave class. It seems they were replacing exactly the same people who worked in the mine, but risked their lives much more in turn. They were hunters, slaves with military skills who were selected specifically to deal with monsters. But the price for their work was as high as the risk of the hunt, and mission success did indeed often promise them extra pay. But our hero wondered a little. Why was an adventurer like him assigned to the miners? Didn't he have enough skills? There must be some reason. At this point, he was approached by the bartender, who told him that he would no longer be lending him money. Zephyr was very surprised indeed, asking, is the daily limit really exceeded? No, his rank is just too low. He won't get another penny. At this point, he wondered what he should do, and even came to the conclusion that he might just take it away from someone. At this point, a girl came up to him and told him that he could open a line of credit if he sold his internal organs, because their temple buys them for scientific research. It was the dumbest suggestion possible. I didn't even think it could be. The guy looked at her with the same disdain and asked to see his documents. The girl, of course, agreed, and said that the operation would be scheduled for next week, and that if he returned the proceeds, he could cancel the operation. Of course, the temple is very good at this sort of thing. The girl smiled and gave him the papers to sign, to which the bartender was really very surprised, asking if this guy was crazy. If not, then why did he sell his organs? At this point, he didn't care about anything at all. He just asked for all the money, which the bartender did, saying he could do what he wanted. After all, he had absolutely no concern for his fate. At this point, he immediately began to drink all the contents, which the girl was very surprised, saying that he is really strange, but also a real man. And the bartender in turn realizes that this is just another guinea pig. At this point, the girl became very embarrassed as he walked away and moved closer to the guy, who was drinking one bottle after another. He was feeling just fine. Everything around him began to shine. He understood and felt that now he was ready for something more. He immediately took another step, after which a knight approached him and asked, will Zephyr accompany them? At this point, the guy smiled very much and said that indeed they came on time. All right. The hunter introduced himself by saying his name was Goeth. He is reconnaissance team leader. And behind him are Dale and Marco. The guy got very excited and said he didn't have night vision skills, but he could use his magic pulse. So he extended his hand to them and hopes that they will work together. Night vision is a skill with which one can see in pitch darkness, whereas the magical pulse sharpened perception thanks to the energy released. It really is a very exciting thing, because these skills are just necessary if you want to penetrate the lair of the monsters unnoticed. The soldiers said that the price for night vision potions is very solid, and since everyone is ready, they can move out. He told the guy to grab his stuff and go ahead. The other soldiers started laughing, saying that Miner's use of magical impulse is very interesting indeed. It was as if he was going to crush the lair with us. They teased him, but he didn't care. He walked with a stony face, throwing his backpack on his shoulders, because he understood his purpose. Let's see, maybe he didn't know those two, but he knew one for sure. He was very glad he'd been transferred to the hunters, a month after the place had been cleaned out. It turns out that 2 people died that time under the vaults of the cave. The soldiers who walked in front of him began to recall the story. Meanwhile, thoughts had returned to our hero's mind. Finally, he could think of a way to use these guys. His face was very satisfied, for he had a plan. He continued on his way, following the rest of the team. Suddenly, one of them started shouting for them to come this way. It seemed they were approaching the entrance to the cave itself. It was a support group. So they asked them to extend their arms forward in order to tie ribbons around their wrists. And so the guy was tied exactly the same ribbon as everyone else, which was very unusual. It turns out that it was a magic bracelet. It was pointed out by one of the head cheerleaders. If anything happened to the guys, the bracelets on his arm would tear, and they could immediately request help from the main headquarters. But he also hoped he wouldn't have to do that, of course. So he asked them to concentrate and do a clean job. After that, he wished them good luck, and the team went straight to the cave. It took them a very, very long time to get there. And they sent our guy first, too, so that if anything happened, he would take the hit. 5 hours later, the team saw the light at the end of the tunnel, from which the foot of an evil monster had already appeared. They were huge monsters of brown color and 2 meters in length that walked around the mine with a torch and a weapon. Suddenly, a piece of rock fell off, which frightened the monsters enough. They looked at it with bewilderment and didn't understand what was going on. Suddenly, behind their backs were our hunters, who were just looking at them. And after 10 seconds, literally, when the monsters completely lost all their vigilance, began to smash them with their swords, crushing and destroying them. And with me, the task of this reconnaissance group is to detect monsters. But they handled and destroyed them very successfully. And collecting information in the lair is also part of their duties. And after a few seconds, the monsters were just lying in the passageway. Against the background of the collected data, a sweep team is formed. And while Zephyr shows you exactly where to go, let's make it clear that the sweep team is slaughtering these all monsters. This is the standard sequence of such missions. These seem to be the ones who were able to survive last time, since there was another lair on the other side of the mine entrance. Groups A and B cleared it out last week. Apparently, the survivors dug a tunnel and lurked here. This is exactly the kind of question a group of hunters began to discuss. Quite expectedly, the scouting group has good military skills. Suddenly, one soldier simply suggested that his boys deal with these monsters themselves. After all, if the scouts thought they could handle the cleanup on their own, they could go into combat without orders. To which the guys were, of course, a little surprised, and frankly, frightened. They went straight to their commander, saying they could just scout the situation and that was it. Why would they put themselves in danger? What if there's a whole pack lurking out there? What if there's a bigger one, and there's only 3 of them? But one of them corrected, said there's actually 4 of them, and all you have to do is just grab a cobalt dungeon. Suddenly, the hunter just blew his mind and became very angry, asking why they were joking around like that. There are 3 of them and 1 bag carrier. Are they really going to go into battle with him? But the smartest of them asked not to get worked up, saying, "Let's just listen to the plan, and then we'll decide something," which surprised and delighted our commander very much, because they had already actually agreed. After that, he turned to our guy and asked him to get what he had. And lo and behold, this is the fruit and leaves of hazelnut. They were very pretty, but if you shred them and mix them with the cobalt remnants, it smells like female cobalt, which surprised everyone, and one of them immediately felt like throwing up. This smell is very strong, so demons will hear it with no problem from 100 meters away and beyond. Suddenly, one of them had already smelled him right away. After that, he became very happy and content. This is exactly what the guys have in mind already, because then when they use this, the demons will immediately run at them from behind all their might. But they will lure them into a trap into which they will fall. When it all worked out, the commander asked what it looked like. After all, he said it would definitely work out. The guys on the team were very surprised and thanked him for such decisions, saying that they respected him a lot, but sometimes, from which he was surprised. Everyone started asking, when did they prepare all this? After all, they hadn't even heard of this method, but it's actually what they call a life experience. Our hero smiled and said that in fact he had invented everything and taught the commander. The hunter commander was very surprised and smiled. In past lives, after he'd been transferred to the hunters, he'd been on the same team as him. Then he sought recognition from other hunters, but he never got the chance. Until we met. At this point, Goth asked what the situation was. Was everything clear? You could tell he was a little scared. But our hero went up to him, looked to see if other people were watching, and said that, to be honest, he had already been down there yesterday, and there is indeed a small lair of surviving kobolds. This made the commander very surprised, for how could he go down there alone? Did he have too much self-confidence? But the guy said that before he got here, he was in charge of scouting for his team, and his ability, that's looking for secret ways. At this point, the commander was very interested and questioned, does he really think the 4 of them could really do quite well if they followed his plan? At this point, the guy answered him affirmatively, saying that, of course, the decision was up to them. But he thought it was definitely worth a try, because this place could bring them really good money. It would be a pity to share it with others. That was exactly the opinion the hunter commander shared, for he realized that the lad was not as useless as he seemed. Hazelnut is not as easy to find as he seems, but he's well prepared and seems to be very familiar with monster hunting. Plus, he likes to leave the decision up to him. So he also thought he might put in a good word for him, and he'd be promoted to hunter very quickly. That's why he gave the guy a gun. It was all in gratitude, and Zephyr thanked him just the same afterwards. But Goth couldn't help thinking that this was probably done on purpose to make him look good. In principle, he didn't care at all. In any case, his effort was commendable, and he's not a total jerk either. Why should he care about some kobold lair? That's why he thrust his sword into another monster, which was already lying there without strength, and said that it was time to finally take from this cave everything it could give. At this point, they were destroying one monster after another, and were really glad that they had already dealt with most of them. And in fact, the guys didn't even think it would be that easy and fun. But it's a shame that the quality of the rocks is really despicable. At this point, our hero said that this passage was clear, so the team ran to it. But suddenly, totally unexpectedly, one of them found something strange. Did it look like bones? Or maybe the remains of some wild animal? But suddenly he was suddenly interrupted, saying it didn't look like it. Maybe it was cobalt bones. At that moment, it was as if the hunter had been transported to another reality, where the hand of the monster tried to grab him. Suddenly, it wasn't a dream, and he was abruptly grabbed and began to be strangled. after which splinters flew all over the cave and Cobalt's arm really came out. Everyone was totally shocked by this, especially the captain, who started shouting toward Dale. Everyone was absolutely terrified. Everyone was scattered all over the place. It was really bad and scary. Suddenly, the hunter took his hammer and connected a hologram to it, which added superpowers, after which he asked the guys to hide behind him and ran into battle. He was very scared. He thought it was all over. But what was lurking there? Could it be the devil? We'll have to get out on the defensive. It was a magical shield that is activated by a hologram. It allows to stop even the leader of the orcs. That's why he doesn't think the monster can penetrate it. Suddenly, a second later, a very strong blow arrives at him, which throws him dozens of meters away, from which the guy got very frightened and received very serious wounds, which destroyed his shield. At this point, the battle continued. The monster was very angry. He wanted to destroy everything in his path, especially those who dared to disturb him. Suddenly, the team saw this tail and was very frightened because he could not believe that this could be. And then a second later, this tail was as surprised and frightened as possible, so he could not move in any way and got hit. At this point, it was already light outside, when suddenly one of the cheerleaders got very nervous. He was looking at his hand and didn't understand what was going on. He remembered the magic bracelets that would tear on his arm in case something happened. In the meantime, absolutely all were torn except one. He didn't understand how 3 bracelets could tear at once, and what was going on down there. At that moment, he reached down and saw a lot of wounds. The warriors were very exhausted, had taken a really huge amount of damage, and the monster was still by no means finished. At this moment, our hero stood in a fighting stance and waited for this monster. He activated Will of Iron, which allowed him to significantly increase his defense functions. He fully absorbed damage, even below his own defense level. It also guaranteed high endurance. He looked at his hand, and he was really surprised because even with this ability, the monster had broken through his defense. At that moment, he looked at it again and realized that it wasn't even 1-year-old yet. After that, he knew right away that it wasn't going to be easy. At this point, Monster Day became his warrior tail and began to raise it, after which he waved it over himself. He was really scary and horrible. It was the Predator, a horrible monster with a long tongue and very sharp teeth, and a demonic gaze. It was really scary to be around him. It was a monster that pretended to be the offspring of other monsters with its pheromones. When it grows up, it even eats its parents. Very much surprised and did not understand what he wanted to do. At this point, the guy started to untwist him and went into the fight was confident. He said he just wanted to stretch out and started smiling. At this point, he looked at his hand, from which magical power had begun to form. He said it was time to grant the last wish. So he asked, "How exactly does the monster want to die?" He immediately straightened his palm and extended it toward the monster. He used a magical force that resembled a key. It was a superpower that opens the door to the Forgotten Castle. The user can put in and take out various kinds of items stored in the Silver Room at any time and place. In a word, it is an artifact from space. At this point, our hero looked and pulled out at once for himself several attributes that could help him now. Everything was shining, and all he got out was a rag and some flowers. Then he threw them on the ground. His commander was shocked by this, watching it all. A dragon soul plant and a cloth? The plant is a natural tonic, and its effect is soothing to the state of mind. At this point, he took the spear in his hand, bandaged it near his arm, and ordered the commander to step back. It was obvious that he was confident and not afraid of anything at all. After the bandage was very strongly tightly tied to the stick, he said it was going to be fun and looked in the direction of the monster. His commander was exhausted, but absolutely could not believe what was happening right now. He tried to stop the guy by asking what he was up to, since he wasn't even a fighter. but he stood beside the monster and was simply cold-blooded. At that moment, he stood up abruptly and realized that if he had to die here, he would never in his life hide like a coward behind Miner's back. At that moment, there was a sharp explosion. Everything went red, and the commander himself was just paralyzed and frightened. Immediately, the monster started screaming and using his superpowers, while our hero just stood there with his spear and waited for him. Right now, a very strong battle has begun, in which there will only be one winner, and the other will die. At this point, the commander fell down and was as frightened as possible, after which the monster immediately directed fear at him. It completely paralyzes the victim, so he just kept lying there, hoping that absolutely no one would touch him. At that moment, a realization came to his mind of a situation that his foreman had told him when he was still a boy. It was a few years ago, in a village where there were terrible battles. All the locals in the village were very scared and prepared for the terrible. Because they were attacked by an adult predator, he was very horrible. It was obvious that he wanted to destroy absolutely everyone. His teeth were huge, and already he was holding a little girl in his hand. Well, the villagers watched everything happening without even blinking their eyes. It was all because their bodies were completely consumed by fear. They were afraid, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. Moreover, they could not even close their eyelids with fear. At that moment, the monster was destroying everything around it, and there was nothing anyone could do. All you had to do was wait for your turn to die. At that moment, the warrior realized that the same fate awaited him and was as frightened as possible. Suddenly, there was a sudden bright flash, which made Goth shocked and could not believe it. Immediately, there were many more of these flashes and sounds, and he couldn't figure out what those sounds were and what he was even looking at now. Tears immediately appeared in his eyes. It turns out that it was just Zephyr who decided to have some fun and waved his spear. Turns out he ducked once more to the monster and proceeded to have a really very brutal battle with it. It was obvious that the monster was times bigger than him and wanted to destroy him. But our hero was also not an easy one. He kept speeding up and swinging his spear, inflicting really good damage on the monster. At that moment, he realized that everything is going great, and these plants are just great. He immediately activated another ability that allowed him to improve the effectiveness of any secret drugs by 500%. Immediately after, he looked at the monster, who was a dozen times his size. He realized that among the 9 special abilities, he only had one weapon. And it also takes a lot of energy from him, so he can't use it right now. At that moment, however, he remembered the flask with green contents, saying that with this monster it would do just as well. It was his recipe from his old friend Venom King, who told him about this potent poison of level 72. At that moment, he remembered sitting beside him by the fireplace, asking if he was sure he should just reveal the secrets of a recipe he had studied all his life. Well, his friend laughed very hard, saying that the world was going to end soon enough. What's the point of hiding anything? Everyone will die in the end anyway, so it's better to use it together. Though no, he stopped him and said he wanted him to use it for sure. Because if I can get even one less creature with it, that would be a very good thing, because I can save someone. At this point, the warrior continued to fight the monster. He immediately pointed his spear, which was laced with poison, at him. At this point, his friend reappeared in his memory, who said that after that he had nothing more to desire. Immediately after that, the spear went into the monster's body, after which the warrior took several more blows. This started to make Predator hate himself. He was very angry, and he also screamed in pain. But the fight went on, and Zephyr still continued to attack him without losing a second of time. This deadly poison was made from the most common herbs. Once it enters the blood vessels, it spreads throughout the body and destroys the internal organs of the monster. And, of course, it causes unbearable pain. It has to be. After that, The warrior started laughing and realized that his friend was still that sadistic man. He looked again at the monster and realized that there were 3 minutes left before I spread all over his body. So he continued to fight it and destroy it. But it's also worth realizing that Predator is just as far from weak. So the guy needs to make it through this time in order to survive. At that moment, the monster came close to him and began waving its tail. But the warrior couldn't expect that at all, and flew as hard as he could to the end of the cave. It was obvious that the monster was really furious and wanted to destroy him, as well as those who got in his way. At that moment, the boy hit a rock and writhed in pain. But abruptly, he opens his eyes as he realizes that the monster is coming right at him. It opened its mouth wide, and it was clear that now it had to escape somehow, as the situation was as dangerous as possible. And he just takes out his potion and throws it into the mouth of the monster itself, so that it will drink it. After that, he immediately bounced and dodged his blow and hit him again with his spear. A second later, the predator felt significant wounds. All we have to do is wait 2 minutes. No, it's already 1. The guy immediately picked up his spear and continued to run into battle. He also noticed that with his current skills, it would be difficult to mention this monster. So after 1 minute, he either tries to survive until the predator is dead, and immediately the fight goes on, or he will just hit him with decisive blows, just like he's doing now. Suddenly, the monster decides to hit him with his tail one more time, and there seems to be absolutely no way our warrior can get rid of it. But wait. He abruptly grabs his tail between his hands, and it looks like he was able to catch it. But the monster didn't expect that either, so it immediately lifted the Zephyr up to dispose of it. Just save yourself, there's not much time left. After a few seconds, he realized he could begin and let go of the monster's tail, then began flying at him with his spear, aiming straight for his eyes. And a second later, our hero was right at his goal. The only thing left was to make the last and accurate blow, which he did very well. At this point, he was already standing on a monster that was in pain and just didn't expect this from ordinary people. But it was not so simple. It immediately, thanks to its powers, broke the spear, after which the guy tried to catch at least parts of it, so as not to be completely unarmed. Well, like a true gentleman, he immediately returned all those spears to the eyes of the monster, telling it to choke. He then took his knife out of his pocket and decided to make one more final stab to make sure everything was completely successful, then immediately stabbed it in the same spot. This made the monster very shocked and screaming, trying his best to throw the hero off his back. But he held on, for his mission was to save himself, and also to help the surviving warriors. He struggled with all his might to at least grab hold of the monster's skin with his hands, who tried to throw him off as hard as he could. And it was a good thing the knife had such a comfortable handle that he was able to hang on to it. But he also realized that it was still early enough, so he continued to hang on. He needed to strike the monster at least one more time. And so when he got into a comfortable position, he remembered going back 10 years, where he had lost everything he could be, better than this monster. He had no power or magical energy, so he had to prepare himself that way. He remembered the water of recovery once more, for if you drink it in large quantities, you can get a hidden effect, an increase in magical energy. Of course, even if you drink a dozen bottles, that efficiency won't go up much. But if you have that special ability, things really are different. He also has skill vision of Hermes, which improves the effectiveness of any potion by 500%. He talks about the magic with which he will succeed in destroying the predator's skull. Immediately thereafter, he swung his fist and used the technique of controlling magical power, then struck with all his might at the spear to hammer them into the middle. He used a discharge, the effect of which was visible outside of mine. Everything began to sparkle very violently. It seemed to be the finale for this monster, as the stones and absolutely everything around them continued to fly around. Suddenly, something very unusual began, immediately after which he was able to grab his arm and began to laugh a lot. He was very happy and remembered him talking about our warrior, saying that if he put in a good word for him, he would quickly be promoted to hunter. He remembered everything that had happened between them, and he was very pleased that the boy had really taken care of him. But he was also very upset about screwing up. It's no wonder, because this guy would quickly get the recognition of the other hunters without his help. He immediately pounded his fist on the ground and said he'd go up, but now he's just a simple miner who can't go down into the dungeon without permission. Even so, he looked at the Zephyr and was just thrilled. So he needed a ticket here in the underground, and Goeth was that ticket. Was very strong and glad he could handle this monster. After that, he immediately went up to Goeth and offered him a chat.